Hello everybody, it's Sarah, and the next about 2 weeks on my channel we're going to wrap up my 2020 reading. I have a total of 5 videos planned. I have my best books of 2020, my worst books, my most surprising reads and my most disappointing reads of 2020, and of course today's video in which I talk about my general stats of 2020 as well as looking at my 2020 goals video and talking about whether or not I managed to keep up with those goals. So yeah, let's get into it, because today is the dry stuff. We're gonna go through the stats. I have my notebook right here because I'm sorry, there's too many numbers, I cannot remember them. Let's start with the basics. How many books did I read? I managed to read a total of 140 books. That might be a little bit of cheating because, you know, everyone counts their reads differently, and I did have 2 DNFs among those 140 books. Usually I only count DNFs if I have read more than 50% of the book, which is not the case for one of my 2 DNFs, but 140 sounds way nicer than 139, so, you know, we're gonna count both of them. Of the 138 books that I actually saw through to the end, 119 were books that were new to me, and then the other 19 were rereads. So actually I didn't have that many rereads this year. The total page number I read though was 62,085. So that is a lot. And I am really proud of that because, you know, I doubled my page number, or about doubled my page number from 2019. So, you know, doubled my books number. I read 72 books I think in 2019 to 114. I doubled my page number. I definitely more than doubled the amount of new books I read because I had 55 of those in 2019, which obviously 119 books is more than double of that. So yeah, I would say I had a good reading year. Now, as for genres, it will come to no surprise of anyone that the biggest amount of books that I read in 2020 was high fantasy. I in fact almost had 50%, 47% exactly high fantasy books. Then in following order, I had 15% urban fantasy, 12% classics, so I did read quite a few classics. I had 8% that was literary fiction, 6% retellings, 6% historical fantasy, 2% sci-fi, 1% magical realism, 1% thriller, 1% historical fiction, 1% dystopian, and 1% non-fiction. And actually, I have to admit, if I count all the genres together that are some type of subgenre in fantasy, 3/4 of what I read in 2020 was fantasy. So yeah, maybe a little bit too much. Maybe I should try to read other genres, although I don't think that will happen in 2021 since I do have a lot of focus on my goals in 2021 to read more adult fantasy. So, but yeah, it's whatever, my channel is fantasy focused anyway. In terms of age range, again, no surprise, most of the books I read were adult. In fact, those were 75% of my reads. Then I had 20% YA reads and the other 5% were kids books / middle grade. The month I read the most books in was October with 19 books, and the least books I read in February with 5 books, and per month I read an average of 11.5 books per month. That makes 3 days of me taking per reading a book. Does it make sense? It took me 3 days to read a book, basically. Going by page count, however, the month I read most in was November, which was almost 8,000 pages, 7,938 to be exact. And the month I read the least in, again, was February with 1,937 pages. So almost exactly 6,000 pages less. Like 6,001 pages less in February compared to November. And with my complete page count over the entirety of the year, I read an average of 170 pages per day, which I have to say is quite a lot for me, to be honest. I think I had a few months where I read over 20 pages per day, in fact. So yeah, I read a lot per day. Since we're already at pages, let's look at the average page length of the book that I read. The page length that most books I read had were between 300 and 399 pages, which were about 33% of the reads that I had. Then after that was between 400 and 499 pages, which were about 20% of the reads I had. And like most of what I read is between the 250 and 700 page range, so quite a big range. I didn't read that many books that were like the same range, but I had a quite big spectrum is what I wanted to say. Although I have to say, and that I wanted to mention extra, I read 7 books this year that were above 1000 pages, which I am again proud of. And the average length of a book that I read in 2020 was about 450 pages, so not too bad. I would say that's like on the longer end of average if you count what most people count as a long book, which is between 500 and 550 pages. Most of the time that's what people count as a longer book to start, and it's kind of the same for me as well. Like under 500 pages, it takes me absolutely no time to read a book. And lastly, let's talk about when the books were published that I read in 2020. Most of the books that I read were published between 2010 and 2019. Those were 30% of the books that I read. Then 27% of the books that I read were new releases, so published in 2020. 17% were published between 2000 and 2009. 18% were published in the 20th century, and then 9% were published in the 19th century. So that's where most of my classics were, obviously, in the 19th century. And I don't think I read any books in 2020 that were published before 1800. For the last few categories, I'm not going to talk about the entirety of the books that I read in 2020, but just talking about the books that were new to me. Also, I just remembered I didn't write it down a category of audiobooks. I read, I think, 2 audiobooks or 1.5 audiobooks or something like that in 2020. The last few categories I want to talk about, I'm just going to talk about the 119 books that I read that were new to me, because I just feel with these 3 categories, for different reasons, there's no use including my rereads. The first of those is where I had the books from that I read in 2020. And obviously, like, my rereads were from my shelf, but aside from my rereads, 23 of the books that I read were books that I previously owned, were books from my physical TBR, which maybe doesn't sound that many since I did read 119 books, and that's a lot of books to acquire from somewhere else. Believe me, I know I'm very lucky that I'm able to do that, but I'm still really happy that I read 23 books of my physical TBR, and we're gonna talk about my physical TBR later when we talk about like looking back at my 2020 goals. Then the rest of the books I obviously acquired from somewhere else. Again, most of those books, I didn't write down the exact number, but most of those books were books that I bought myself, and then quite a few of those books were also books that I got as gifts or that I borrowed from somewhere, not from the library, but like from my mom, from friends, and so on. Next, let's go on to diversity, and let's start with diversity among authors, starting with gender. Contrary to most people, even on BookTube, who read adult high fantasy, I think I'm the only person who does not struggle with reading mostly female authors. 60% of the authors that I read were women. So the only thing that I do want to be more conscious of within 2021 and going into the future is reading less, you know, cis authors, and reading more authors that belong to the trans community, be they trans women or men, or be they non-binary, gender non-conforming, that was it, sorry, gender non-conforming or anything like that. I had a handful of authors that fall into those categories within 2020, but I definitely need to be more conscious of this going into the future. Next, let's talk about BIPOC authors, and I kind of have a mixed bag right here. First of all, I did not track the exact heritage or ethnicity of the authors. I only tracked whether they were BIPOC or not. So I know that even within the BIPOC authors that I read, I'm pretty homogenous. So I read mostly, or I have read mostly Black American, Afro-American authors or Asian American authors. and I do want to kind of branch out to read more South American authors, to read more Middle Eastern authors, and so on. But I'm gonna track that in 2021, did not track it in 2020. But now, looking at the books that I read, if I look just purely at the numbers, then I have to say that I improved a lot from 2019 to 2020. I think I read maybe 5 or 7 books by POC authors in 2019. I didn't track that yet, so I can't tell you the exact number. And this year I read 34 books by POC authors. So the number was like, I don't know, 5 to 7 times the amount of what I read in 2019. So if you look at that, I just doubled my reading from 2019 to 2020, then it has gotten better. However, if I look at percentages, that is still only 25%, about a quarter of the books that I read in 2020. And that is not enough for me. So I do want to improve that even more within 2021. I hope that made sense. I talked a lot right now, but yeah. Anyway, I did better, but I can do even better. That's the gist of it. And now let's look at diversity within the contents of the book. These books are not necessarily all own voices authors. However, I am quite strict at what I count a diverse book. So, for example, I will not count it as diversity. Diversity, by the way, is LGBT, mental illness, race, all the good stuff. But I will not count it as diversity, for example, if it's a side character, even if it's a main side character who is the diverse character within the cast. I only count diversity if it is the main characters themselves that belong to a minority group. As an example, within LGBT, I would not count Chain of Gold as a diverse book. There's a lot of LGBT characters within the book. However, the main 3 characters, Lucy, James, and Cordelia, all 3 are not LGBT characters. There is a POV character with 1 or 2 chapters who is LGBT, but he isn't one of the main characters, so I do not count Chain of Gold as a diverse read. However, of course, Lost Book of the White would count as a diverse read because Magnus and Alec are the main characters. I just chose these 2 because both were by Cassandra Clare, both are quite well known, obviously. But that just goes how strict I am with counting diverse reads. And because of that, only 40% of the books that I read within 2020 count as diverse reads, included mental illness, race, LGBT, and so on. However, I am sure if I were a bit less harsh on myself, if I, for example, counted Chain of Gold, I'd be up to probably 70 or 80% of the reads. But yeah, I'm just, you know, really strict on myself when it comes to what counts as diversity or not. And now the last category before we go to looking back at my 2020 goals are the star ratings. I had an average of about 3 stars, so, you know, not very good. Again, not counting any rereads because obviously I'm like only rereading books that I loved the first few times that I read them, so they're gonna be 5 stars or 4 stars. But yeah, average was about a 3 star. Let's go in order. I had 14 5-star ratings, of which like at least half of them have been since September, so my reading has improved a lot since September. I have 6 4.5 stars. I have 37 4 stars, which in fact is the biggest category, so the most books I rated the same star rating were 4 stars. Then I had 17 3.5 stars, I had 25 3 stars, I had 9 2.5 stars, so quite a few of those. I had 5 2 stars and I had 2 1.5 stars. So no 1 stars, luckily, but then I don't give out 1 star rating very often because I literally only give 1 star ratings to books that have a very intense reaction on my part. Let's move on to looking back at my 2020 goals. The first of my goals was finishing series. I of course started my own TBR jar because of that, and I have to say I was quite successful with that. I did a whole series on my DNFs, my unfinished and my finished series on my shelves. I will leave all 3 of the videos linked down below, so go and check them out if you're interested in which series exactly I finished and so on. But in 2020 I started 9 series. However, I finished 12 series, and most of the series I started were series I caught up right away because they were series that had their first book out and so on. Also, I DNF'd a lot of series, so that also led to me having less unfinished series on my shelves. Oh, very quickly, I forgot one last stat, and that was the longest and the shortest book I read in 2020. The longest book was Rhythm of War with about 1,230 pages, and the shortest book was Carmilla with about 80 pages. And I mean, I did read longer books because I think 1 or 2 of the books that are earlier in the Stormlight Archive series by Brandon Sanderson are longer, but those were rereads, so they were quite easy. But then moving on again to my second goal, my book buying ban. My book buying ban basically was that I'm allowed to buy as many books as I want, but I gotta finish all of them by the end of the year to not drag any books with me into the new year. And I was quite good at that. I only dragged 2 books with me into the new year. The first of those was Knife of Dreams by Robert Jordan, which is the 11th book in the Wheel of Time series, and that one just arrived really late because of Corona, so I only had like 5 days left in the year and I didn't want to start it, so yeah. Dragged that one with me. And the second book was a book I got from my mom for Christmas, which is a collection of women's poetry, and it's like massive, 800 pages, gonna be a project in 2021, and I'm so excited for it. Then in terms of my TBR shelf, I had 71 books on my TBR shelf at the beginning of the year. Now, with reading those books as well as unhauling them, I have 32 left, so I more than halved the number of my physical TBR. And I would say that's very successful. I'm quite proud of that, and maybe in 2021 it is my goal to get to a TBR 0. So sorry, but my battery was empty. But yeah, the first 3 goals of 2020 were a success. I did finish a lot of series. I did mostly manage with my book buying ban. And my book buying ban I only really counted until Christmas, and every book that I get around Christmas and afterwards doesn't really count. Because, you know, there's only 5 days left of the year. And then the third goal of my TBR shelf I'm also quite happy with. And then the next goal I did not manage to finish, and that was finishing the Wheel of Time series. I have 4 books left in that series, sadly, so yeah, that wasn't that big of a success. Next I had the goal of diversifying my reading in terms of genre, and for that I had the goal of reading 1 book per month, or at least 1 book per month that is not some subgenre of fantasy. And I did really well with that as well. I mean, it doesn't sound that much, like the grand scale of things. I read 36 books in 2020 that weren't fantasy, but that comes down to 3 books a month that weren't fantasy, so I'm quite happy with that as well. Then I had the goal of reading Le Morte d'Arthur by Sir Thomas Malory. I did manage to do that. I had the goal of rereading The Black Jewels before the 10th book comes out. I also did do that. And the last goal was to reread the Stormlight Archive before Rhythm of War comes out. And I also did do that. And yeah, that was it for my stats and goals of 2020. And so tell me in the comments down below, how was your reading in 2020? Did you succeed? Did you fail? Although, let's be honest, we all got through 2020, so that is a success in and of itself, and it does not matter if you failed any of your reading goals, because, you know, we had to deal with stuff. But anyway, if you enjoyed this video, maybe think about giving me a thumbs up and also maybe subscribing. All the links to my social media are in the description box down below, so go and check those out. All the links to my book club of Queens, Witches and Valkyries, where we read 1 adult high fantasy book written by a woman per month. Next month, so this month actually, January, we're reading The Sword of Kaigen by M.L. Wang, but the links will also be in the description box down below. And yeah, once I have all the other videos uploaded, if you happen to watch this one later, I will have a playlist that is linked down below. And with that said, I hope I'll see you soon, and I hope you started out well into 2021. Bye!